The third and final Derflinger-class battlecruiser, SMS Hindenburg, is the topic of today's video. Here you have what was, likely, the finest battlecruiser, Grossekreutzer, that Germany ever finished. She had notable improvements on her sister ships, from her turrets to her theoretical top speed. Hindenburg was a fine ship, and more than a match for most Royal Navy battlecruisers, in everything but raw firepower. And yet, she never got the chance to prove herself. Wartime delays in her construction would see her finish too late to participate at Jutland. In the aftermath of that battle, Germany never again committed to a massive brawl at sea, with the direct result that Hindenburg's service history largely amounted to training missions and ill-fated attempts at action. She is, as such, arguably better known for her salvage than for anything she did while afloat. So, with all of that in mind, let's take a look at the story of SMS Hindenburg, from construction to her ultimate fate, brought out of the mud of Scapa Flow to be scrapped by the enemy she never fought. That story began at the end of May 1912, when design work began on GK 1913. This ship was the subject of one of the periodic attempts to radically improve on design. In this specific case, there was a desire to improve the main battery turrets, increase the secondary battery, change up the torpedo loadout, and other, more minor changes. The first one, the main battery, was going to see improved shell hoists, plus the rangefinders off the Bayern class. The secondaries, meanwhile, were planned to increase in number from 14 barrels to 18. As for the torpedoes, those would have seen the stern tube replaced by 2 aft tubes, in addition to new torpedoes being carried aboard the ship. There was also an attempt to rearrange the diesel dynamos and increase speed, though these were dropped relatively early on, especially the speed, as that would have required a large increase in tonnage and a lengthening of the citadel. All of these changes would have amounted to several hundred additional tons, and because of the lengthening of the citadel, a functionally new design. Unsurprisingly, Admiral Tirpitz stepped in at that point and forbid any such design change. On the other hand, it was a bit of a surprise when he instead suggested going a step further, or a sidestep in any case. Tirpitz essentially asked what it would look like if the design was kept more or less the same as Derflinger, but with an increase in main battery size from 8 30.5 cm 12-inch guns to the same number of 35 cm 13.8-inch guns. The Admiral was promptly answered with, "Not worth it." To keep the design more or less the same, but increase firepower, necessitated a speed reduction of half a knot, an armor reduction from 300mm to 270mm, and the removal of bow armor, in addition to only carrying 85 shells per main gun. All of this would raise the price from 31.5 million marks to 33.3 million marks. Tirpitz promptly vetoed it on grounds of increased cost and displacement. Instead, Ersatz Hertha, as she was known at the time, would be a repeat of Lutzow for the most part. Some changes in the design did manage to sneak in, however, and I'll cover those real quick before moving to service history. First, there were some fairly minor changes to her internal layout. These consisted of a quick loading device for her torpedoes, a better laid out middle passageway, ventilators beneath the armor deck, and a lengthened superstructure. That last one put in place to make for better accommodations aboard ship. All of these, combined, added up to about 130 extra tons, which led the German designers to increase Ersatz Hertha's length by 2.5 meters, about 8 feet, to maintain her speed. The bigger changes, however, were much more noticeable. Well, aside from an increase in her turret roof armor to 150mm. Can't really notice that one if you aren't good at looking at blueprints. But the other changes, those were easy to see. Perhaps most notable of all being the fitting of a large tripod mast, which was quite distinctive, to the point that it set her apart from both of her sisters until Derflinger was refit with a similar mast. Internally, then, the major change came to her turrets. These were, from the outset, capable of an elevation of 16 degrees. This was an improvement compared to 13.5 degrees on her sister ships, allowing for longer range fire. Specifically, Ersatz Hertha could fire about 2,200 yards further than her sister ships. Another change, and one you could easily see if you were inside the ship, was to her loading systems. Each of the turrets was fitted with two major changes. First, the manual backup traverse was replaced with an electric motor. Secondly, there was an improved loading system fitted. This is the most notable holdover from the initial design changes. This new shell elevator had been installed on the sternmost turret of the earlier ships, but was fitted to all four turrets on the new design. And with this new system, the elevators could supply shells at a rate of 3 per minute. With these changes, as well as some minor changes to her power plant, Airsat's Hertha would finally be laid down on October 1st, 1913. By the time she was launched on August 1st, 1915, she had picked up the name Hindenburg in a reflection of that particular general's sudden hero status. The ship that came out of this was, in most ways, fairly similar to her sisters. She carried the same main battery of 8 30.5cm 12-inch guns in her modified turrets. 4 twin turrets, to be specific, fitted in super-firing pairs on the bow and stern, with the stern pair a bit further apart from each other. Her secondary battery was the same as Lutzo's, at 14 15cm 5.9-inch guns, which was an increase of 2 barrels on the 12 carried by Derflinger. To round out her weaponry, Hindenburg carried 4 88mm anti-aircraft guns and 4 60cm torpedo tubes. These were set up with 1 in the bow, 1 in the stern, and 2 on the broadside. Armor protection was, again, broadly the same as her sister ships. A main belt that reached 300mm, 11.8 inches at its thickest, thinning to 120mm forward and 100mm aft. Deck armor was a fairly thick, for the time, 80mm, 3.1 inches at its thickest. That just leaves her speed to finish this section off. Hindenburg was rated for 72,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. This was provided by 14 coal-fired and 8 oil-fired boilers. In theory, that would give the ship a speed of 27 knots. In practice, it's a bit harder to say. Hindenburg wasn't able to run proper sea trials, considering the rather large war going on, with the Grand Fleet blockading Germany. As a direct result, while she managed 96,000 shaft horsepower on her trials, that only equated to 26.6 knots. This was, however, in less than ideal conditions. British and German battlecruisers cites this as something more equivalent to 28.5 knots in proper conditions. With that, though, we finish off her design and statistics, which leaves us with the less than exciting service history. Because, in spite of launching in August 1915, Hindenburg wouldn't be completed until May 10, 1917. This long fitting out process was due to labor and material shortages, with so much focus diverted to supplying the German army and building U-boats. It was bad enough that the British, at the time, apparently thought it was because she was stripped down to repair Derflinger after the pounding the Iron Dog took at Jutland. In the event, those labor shortages meant she wasn't fully operational until October of 1917. This meant that she only had a little over a year of actual service, which didn't feature any major actions. It also means that Hindenburg was the last battlecruiser, and the last capital ship in general, completed by Imperial Germany. Regardless, by the time her sea trials and assorted modifications were complete, it was already late 1917, and Germany was on the back foot, both on land and at sea. With the obvious exception of U-boats, the German fleet was largely confined to the Baltic for offensive actions. Hindenburg wasn't even used on those, both as a reflection of her importance as the most modern Große and simply because her speed wasn't really needed there. It wouldn't be until November 17, 1917, that Hindenburg was sent into action. This was part of an attempt to support German minesweepers and light forces at the Second Battle of Helgoland-Bight, which saw the British forces retreat before the German heavy forces arrived. Hindenburg, as such, returned to port, where, by the end of November, she had become the new flagship of the 1st Scouting Group. Unfortunately, her flagship duty didn't equate to greater combat duty. Most of her time remained spent on supporting minesweepers and mine layers alongside training duty. In point of fact, the only other time Hindenburg had a chance at action would be on April 23, 1918. At that time, the Germans were making their final real attempt at divide and conquer against the Grand Fleet. A series of raids on Norwegian convoys had convinced the British to detach heavy forces to guard those convoys. This was a golden opportunity, from the German perspective, to do what they had been trying to do since the start of the war: sortie in force, ambush a detached portion of the Grand Fleet, and destroy it. Hindenburg set sail on the morning of the 23rd at the head of the battle line. This was under strict wireless silence, though the British still managed to intercept a few messages. Not that it would matter, even if they hadn't. Because, only an hour after leaving port, SMS Moltke lost her inner starboard propeller. The resulting damage to her machinery forced her to be taken in tow to return to port. While her engines would eventually be repaired, this delay, and the fact the British convoy was a day late, meant the Germans missed their chance. More pertinent to this video, Hindenburg missed her chance. Hindenburg would spend the remainder of 1918 either confined to port or engaging on more mine warfare escort duty. She would never again get a chance at the Grand Fleet. The final chance she might have had, the infamous death ride of the High Seas Fleet, never materialized. German sailors, understandably not particularly happy about throwing their lives away like that, mutinied. While Hindenburg was far from the worst off in this regard, the fleet as a whole was paralyzed by the mutinies. As a result, the German fleet did not go on a death ride. Having never fired her guns in anger, Hindenburg was part of the High Seas Fleet and turned in Scapa Flow. From the end of November 1918 until June 21, 1919, she remained there, under the watchful gaze of the British, with her crew forced to stay aboard ship. On that June day, however, Admiral Ludwig von Reuter ordered the fleet scuttled, under the assumption the British were prepared to seize the ships. So it was on June 21, 1919, that the High Seas Fleet enacted their final act of defiance. Hindenburg would continue to be the last ship here, the last capital ship completed, and the last to sink at Scapa Flow. By 5 p.m. that afternoon, she was resting upright on the bottom of the anchorage. She came to rest in shallow enough water that her funnels and masts, distinctive tripod included, remained above water. This was an intentional decision on the part of her captain to make it easier for his crew to get off the ship. That it also kept her flag flying in full sight of the British was a happy coincidence, I'm sure. In any case, Hindenburg remained on the bottom of the anchorage until 1930. There were several attempts to raise her, though these were hampered by the difficulty of patching holes and fixing damage from the scuttling and time underwater. Men would have to go into the dark depths of the ship, clear things out and seal holes, before water could be pumped out and they could properly work. Even when the ship was lifted from the bottom, Hindenburg proceeded to develop a severe list and promptly sink once again. At least her sinking was an accident, unlike poor Seydlitz, which had to be raised 3 times because the man in charge of the salvage wanted to be recorded raising her. Regardless, Hindenburg was pulled up, with superstructure cut away to lighten the ship. She was then towed off and scrapped between 1930 and 1932. She never saw combat, but Hindenburg remained a beautiful ship that deserves some more attention, if only for her status as the last Imperial German capital ship, or at least the last to be completed. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.